The gunshot echoed through Belmont, Nevada like thunder, silencing every patron in the Silver Dollar Saloon as Bridget Lawson crashed backward through the batwing doors, landing hard in the dusty street. Blood trickled from her split lip as she struggled to rise, her fine blue dress now soiled with the town's gritty soil. The saloon doors swung open again, revealing three men in expensive suits, their laughter cutting through the evening air as they stared down at her fallen form. "That'll teach you to speak out of turn, woman," the largest of them sneered, adjusting his gold pocket watch with practiced indifference. Bridget's fingers dug into the dirt as she tried to push herself up, her auburn hair falling in disarray around her face. At 22, she'd seen enough of life's cruelties, but nothing had prepared her for the humiliation of being thrown out like garbage simply for defending her father's good name. The crowd that had gathered to watch remained silent, no one daring to intervene against Harold Blackwell and his associates, the men who owned half the silver mines in the territory and, by extension, controlled Belmont itself. "Look at her," Blackwell taunted, gesturing dramatically. "The proud daughter of a failed miner, thinking she deserves respect in this town." His companions laughed harder as Bridget slipped again, her attempt to stand with dignity thwarted by the pain shooting through her ribs where Blackwell had struck her moments earlier inside the saloon. The crowd's silence broke with the steady rhythm of approaching hoofbeats. A tall figure on horseback emerged from the shadows at the edge of town, the setting sun silhouetting man and beast as they approached the scene. They laughed as she fell in the dust. A witness would later recall when retelling the story. The stranger dismounted with fluid grace, boots landing heavily in the street. His face remained shadowed beneath the wide brim of a well-worn Stetson, but his voice carried clearly in the evening air. "Pick on someone who can fight back," the cowboy said, his hand resting casually near his holstered Colt. Bridget looked up through strands of her hair, her green eyes meeting the intense gaze of a man she'd never seen before, a man whose arrival would forever alter the course of her life in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. Thomas Wade had ridden into Belmont with no intention of staying longer than it took to rest his horse and replenish his supplies. After 3 years working cattle drives across the territory, he'd earned enough to buy a small parcel of land near Carson City. All he needed was to cash in his pay and move on, not get involved in local disputes. Yet here he stood, positioning himself between a fallen woman and 3 well-dressed men who clearly held power in this mining town. At 30, Thomas had learned to read trouble quickly, and these men reeked of it. "This doesn't concern you, stranger," Blackwell said, his smile not reaching his cold eyes. "Just a local matter being settled." Thomas removed his hat, revealing sun-bronzed features and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. 3 men throwing a woman into the street. "Seems like an unusual way to settle matters where I come from." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some backing away, sensing the tension building like storm clouds. "She insulted me," Blackwell declared, puffing out his chest. "In my own establishment." "Your establishment?" Thomas questioned, extending a hand to help Bridget to her feet. When she accepted it, he noted the strength in her grip despite her disheveled appearance. "I wasn't aware the silver dollar had changed hands." Blackwell's face reddened. "I own what matters in Belmont, including the debt on that saloon." Thomas steadied Bridget beside him, feeling her trembling slightly, though whether from fear or anger he couldn't tell. "Are you all right, madam?" he asked quietly. "I'm fine," she answered, though the quiver in her voice betrayed her. "But you shouldn't involve yourself. These men are dangerous." Thomas nodded slightly, acknowledging her warning while keeping his eyes fixed on Blackwell and his companions. "I've met dangerous men before. usually find they're not half as dangerous as they believe themselves to be. A tense silence followed as Blackwell assessed the newcomer. The fading light glinted off Thomas's worn, but well-maintained firearms, a Colt revolver on his hip, and what looked to be a Winchester rifle in his saddle scabbard. "You've got a mouth on you, cowboy," Blackwell finally said. "But I've got business to attend to that's more important than teaching you manners." He straightened his jacket and gestured to his companions. "Come on, boys. The poker game awaits." As they turned to re-enter the saloon, Blackwell paused, pointing a finger at Bridget. "This isn't finished, Miss Lawson. Your father's debt comes due by the end of the month. I suggest you start packing your belongings." After they disappeared inside, the crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves about the confrontation they'd just witnessed. Bridget brushed dirt from her dress with shaking hands. "Thank you," she said quietly, "but you've likely just made an enemy you didn't need." Thomas retrieved a handkerchief from his pocket and offered it to her for her bleeding lip. "Wouldn't be the first time. I'm Thomas Wade, Bridget Lawson." She accepted the handkerchief gratefully. "You're new to Belmont." "Just passing through," he confirmed. "Or at least that was the plan." She dabbed at her lip, wincing slightly. "Well, Mr. Wade, you might want to reconsider even that brief stay. Harold Blackwell doesn't forget slights, and he employs men who handle his grudges." Thomas glanced toward the saloon doors. "What did you say to him that warranted being thrown into the street?" A bitter smile crossed Bridget's face. "I told him my father never would have sold him mining rights if he'd known what kind of man Blackwell truly was." Her eyes flashed with defiance. "And I called him a thief and a liar to his face." Thomas couldn't help but laugh softly. "That would do it." "My father is ill," she continued, her voice growing serious again. "Blackwell's been pressuring him to sign over our remaining claim. When that didn't work, he suddenly produced papers showing we owe him money we don't have." A familiar story, Thomas thought. He'd seen it play out in countless boomtowns across the territory, wealthy men using questionable means to acquire land and assets from those with less power. "I should get home," Bridget said, handing back his handkerchief. "My father will be worried." Thomas retrieved the reins of his horse. "Allow me to escort you. It's getting dark." She hesitated, studying him carefully. "That's kind but unnecessary. Our home is just at the edge of town, and you've already risked enough on my behalf." "Consider it a courtesy, not a risk," Thomas replied. "Besides, I'd like to make sure you get there safely." After a moment's consideration, she nodded. "Very well, Mr. Wade." They walked in silence through Belmont's main street, Thomas leading his horse alongside them. The town had grown substantially since the silver strike of '65, boasting several brick buildings among the wooden structures. Mining equipment and ore wagons lined the streets, testament to the wealth being pulled from the surrounding mountains. "You mentioned you're passing through," Bridget said eventually. "Where are you headed?" "Carson City, ultimately. I've saved enough to buy a small ranch, nothing fancy, but it'll be mine." "A noble ambition," she said with genuine warmth. "We came here with similar dreams 5 years ago. My father believed Belmont would be our chance at a new beginning after my mother passed." Thomas noted the way her voice softened when speaking of her father, and he struck silver, a modest claim, nothing like Blackwell's operations, but enough to build a good life. Her expression darkened. "Until my father fell ill last winter. That's when our troubles with Blackwell began in earnest." They approached a small but well-maintained cabin at the edge of town. A lantern glowed in the window, casting a warm light into the gathering darkness. "This is us," Bridget said, stopping at the front gate. "Thank you again for your intervention, Mr. Wade." "Thomas, please." She smiled slightly, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "Thomas, then." though I suspect our paths won't cross again if you're wise enough to leave Belmont by morning." Before he could respond, the cabin door opened, revealing an older man leaning heavily on a cane. Despite his frail appearance, his voice carried strength and concern. "Bridget, is that you? You're late returning." "Yes, Father, I'm sorry to worry you." She hurried toward the door, then paused to look back at Thomas. "Safe travels, Mr. Wade." Thomas tipped his hat to them both before turning back toward town. He had intended to spend the night at the hotel, before continuing his journey at first light. Now, he found himself wondering what other secrets Belmont might be hiding behind its prosperous facade. The morning brought clear skies and a decision Thomas hadn't anticipated making. Rather than continuing his journey, he found himself at the mining office reviewing public records of claims filed in the district. The clerk, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, watched him curiously. "You looking to invest, mister? Most of the good claims are taken." Thomas studied the maps spread before him. "Just getting familiar with the area. I understand Harold Blackwell owns significant holdings here." The clerk nodded vigorously. "Yes, sir. Mr. Blackwell controls the 3 largest producing mines in the district. Smart businessman, that one." "And the Lawson claim, where's that located?" The clerk's enthusiasm dimmed noticeably. "Lawson, that's a smaller operation northeast of town. Not much production lately with Ephraim Lawson being sick and all. But it's still active. Technically, yes. Though there's talk it might change hands soon." The clerk leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Between you and me, Blackwell's had his eye on that parcel for some time. Says it connects to one of his existing tunnels." Thomas thanked the man and headed out, his next destination clear in his mind. The Lawson mine wasn't difficult to find once he'd located the path leading northeast from town. The operation was modest compared to the large industrial setups. He'd passed a single tunnel entrance with basic equipment scattered about, much of it looking unused for some time. He was examining an ore cart when a familiar voice called out from behind him. Most prospectors at least pretend to stake their own claims before trespassing on others. Thomas turned to find Bridget standing a few yards away, a rifle balanced casually in her arms. She looked different in the daylight, her auburn hair neatly braided, wearing practical work clothes rather than the dress from the previous evening. A fading bruise at the corner of her mouth was the only evidence of her encounter with Blackwell. "I'm not prospecting," Thomas assured her, raising his hand slightly. "Just curious about what Blackwell finds so appealing about this particular claim." She lowered the rifle, recognition replacing wariness in her expression. "Mr. Wade, I thought you'd be miles away by now." "Seems I'm not as wise as you gave me credit for," he replied with a slight smile. "And I asked you to call me Thomas." Bridget approached, setting the rifle against a nearby post. "What are you doing here, Thomas? Something didn't sit right with me about last night." "I wanted to understand what's really happening in Belmont." She studied him for a long moment, as if debating how much to reveal. "You should leave town," she finally said. "Blackwell isn't someone to underestimate. Neither am I." Thomas gestured toward the mine entrance. "Your father's still working this claim." Bridget's shoulders sagged slightly. "Trying to. He comes out most days despite his health. Says the fresh air does him good, but I know he's worried about losing everything." She picked up a small rock, turning it over in her hands. "We need to show some production to maintain our legal rights to the claim, but with just the 2 of us." "It's difficult," Thomas finished for her. She nodded, tossing the rock aside. "Father believes there's a rich vein just beyond where we stopped digging last fall, before his lungs got bad from years underground." Thomas glanced at the mine entrance thoughtfully. "I've done some mining work in Colorado, not my favorite occupation, but I know my way around underground." Bridget's eyes widened slightly. "Are you offering to help? You don't even know us." "Consider it curiosity for now," Thomas said. "I'd like to see what Blackwell is so determined to get his hands on." Before she could respond, a coughing sound drew their attention to the path from town. Ephraim Lawson approached slowly, leaning heavily on his walking stick, each step seemingly requiring immense effort. "Father, you shouldn't have walked all this way alone," Bridget hurried to his side. "Nonsense," the older man wheezed, though he accepted his daughter's supportive arm. "A man should check his property daily." His gaze shifted to Thomas. "And who might this be?" "Thomas Wade, sir," Thomas said, stepping forward to offer his hand. "I had the pleasure of meeting your daughter in town yesterday." Ephraim's handshake was surprisingly firm despite his frail appearance. "Ah, you're the cowboy who stood up to Blackwell. News travels fast in Belmont." His eyes, the same striking green as his daughter's, assessed Thomas carefully. That was either very brave or very foolish, depending on one's perspective. "Father," Bridget admonished gently. "No, he's right," Thomas agreed. "Probably more the latter than the former." Ephraim chuckled, which triggered another coughing spell. When it subsided, he wiped his mouth with a handkerchief, not quite hiding the flecks of blood from Thomas's observant gaze. "What brings you to our humble claim, Mr. Wade?" "Thomas was just leaving," Bridget answered quickly, casting a meaningful look his way. Thomas ignored the hint. "Actually, sir, I was hoping to learn more about your operation here. I understand Blackwell has shown unusual interest in this particular claim." Ephraim's expression darkened. "That vulture has been circling since my first coughing fit, offered to buy me out for a fraction of what this land is worth." He gestured toward the mine entrance with his cane. "There's a reason for that. My last surveys showed a vein running through this mountain that could be as rich as anything Blackwell's found." "Father, you shouldn't exert yourself," Bridget said, concern evident in her voice. "Let's get you seated in the shade." They moved to a small wooden bench beneath a pine tree. Once Ephraim was settled, Bridget retrieved a canteen of water for him. "Mr. Wade," Ephraim continued after taking a drink, "are you familiar with mining operations?" "I've worked a few claims," Thomas admitted. "Though cattle's been my main occupation these past years." "Yet you're interested in our troubles with Blackwell." Thomas considered his words carefully. "I've seen men like him before. They take what isn't theirs because they believe their money makes them untouchable." Ephraim studied him intently. "And that bothers you enough to delay your travels?" "It does." The older man nodded slowly. "Then perhaps you'd consider a proposition. I need help demonstrating that this claim is still active and productive." "Blackwell's using my illness to suggest to the mining commissioner that the claim should be forfeit, if I could show even modest production." "Father," Bridget interjected, "you can't ask a stranger to risk himself. The tunnel needs shoring up before anyone goes further in." "I'm merely suggesting Mr. Wade might hire on temporarily," Ephraim replied calmly. "At fair wages, of course." Thomas looked between father and daughter, noting Bridget's concern and Ephraim's quiet determination. "I'd need to see the tunnel first," he said finally. "Assess what needs to be done." Relief washed over Ephraim's face. "Of course, Bridget can show you. She knows this operation almost as well as I do." Bridget appeared ready to object further, but instead sighed in resignation. "Very well. But we stay together, and at the first sign of any structural issues, we come straight back out." Thomas nodded his agreement, and they gathered lanterns from the small shed nearby. As they prepared to enter the mine, Thomas couldn't help wondering what he was getting himself into. His plans had been clear: reach Carson City, purchase his land, start building something permanent for himself. Yet here he was, potentially delaying those plans for people he barely knew. The cool darkness of the mine tunnel enveloped them as they moved carefully forward, the lantern light casting long shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Bridget led the way with confident steps, clearly familiar with every turn and dip in the passage. "My father started this operation before I was born," she explained as they walked. "He sold his first claim to finance this one, believing the geology here promised greater rewards." "Was he right?" Thomas asked, ducking under a low-hanging support beam. "We've found enough to sustain us over the years. Nothing spectacular until last fall, when we hit promising indicators of a major vein." She pointed to a glittering streak in the rock wall. "See that? Father believes it's leading to something significant deeper in the mountain." Thomas examined the rock face closely. His mining experience was limited, but even he recognized the potential value of what he was seeing. "And this connects to Blackwell's operation somehow," Bridget nodded grimly. "His easternmost tunnel runs parallel to ours, perhaps 50 yards through the mountain. Father believes the vein we're tracking extends into both properties, which would explain Blackwell's sudden interest in acquiring your claim." "Exactly. And his creative accounting regarding debts my father supposedly owes." They continued deeper into the tunnel, coming eventually to a spot where the passage narrowed, and several support beams showed signs of stress. "This is where we stopped," Bridget said, raising her lantern to illuminate the area better. "The timber began creaking last November. Father wanted to replace the supports before proceeding, but then his illness worsened." Thomas examined the structural elements carefully, testing several of the beams with his hands. "These need replacing, no doubt about it, but it's doable with the right materials and enough hands." "Which we lack," Bridget said quietly. "I can assist, but Father can barely manage the walk from town these days, though he refuses to admit it." Thomas turned to her, his expression serious. "I have some savings, enough to hire a couple of men to help with the heavy work." Her eyes widened in surprise. "Why would you do that?" "You don't owe us anything. Consider it an investment," he replied. "If your father is right about that vein, everyone involved stands to profit." Bridget studied him skeptically. "Most men passing through Belmont are looking to make their fortune quickly, not invest in struggling operations." "I'm not most men." Thomas's eyes held her steadily. "And I've never been comfortable seeing bullies get their way." For a long moment, the only sound was the distant dripping of water echoing through the tunnel. Finally, Bridget spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You realize Blackwell won't simply stand by and watch." "I'm counting on it," Thomas replied, a determined glint in his eye. Back in town that afternoon, Thomas visited the assay office with a few rock samples from the Lawson mine. The assayer, a middle-aged man with permanently stained fingers, examined the specimens with professional interest. "Good quality ore," he confirmed. "Higher silver content than most of what comes through lately." "Where'd you find this?" "Just exploring the area," Thomas answered vaguely. "What would you estimate it's worth?" The assayer weighed the samples and made some calculations. "Based on current prices, ore of this quality would fetch about $40 per ton, assuming it's consistent throughout." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "And who processes most of the ore from the smaller claims around here?" "Blackwell's mill handles nearly everything," the assayer replied. "He charges a processing fee, of course, but it's cheaper than transporting raw ore to Austin or Carson City." This confirmed what Thomas had suspected. Blackwell controlled not just the richest mines, but the means of processing ore from the smaller operations as well, giving him leverage over the entire district. After leaving the assay office, Thomas made his way to the town's only lumber yard, where he arranged for timber delivery to the Lawson mine the following morning. His next stop was the Silver Spur Saloon, deliberately avoiding the Silver Dollar, where Blackwell and his men would likely be gathered. The Silver Spur catered to miners and working men rather than the town's elite. Thomas ordered a whiskey and casually struck up conversations, learning that two experienced miners named Jackson and Cooper had recently been laid off from one of the smaller operations after Blackwell purchased it. "They're good men," the bartender confirmed. "Been mining these hills for years. Shame to see them struggling now. Any idea where I might find them? Cooper's likely still at his cabin out past the creek. Jackson sometimes does odd jobs at the livery stable." With this information, Thomas set out to locate the men. By sundown, he had secured commitments from both to begin work at the Lawson mine the next day. Their expressions had shifted from skepticism to interest when he described the quality of ore he'd seen, and from interest to determination when he mentioned standing against Blackwell's attempts to seize the claim. "That bastard's ruined more than one honest miner in this district," Cooper had growled. "Be glad to help keep something out of his grasping hands." When Thomas arrived at the Lawson cabin that evening to share his progress, he found Bridget on the porch, her face tight with worry. "What's happened?" he asked immediately. "Blackwell sent his lawyer this afternoon," she explained, handing him a formal-looking document. "Notice that our debt payment is due in full by the end of next week, not the end of the month as he'd previously stated." Thomas scanned the document. "Is the original loan agreement mentioned here legitimate?" She shook her head vehemently. "No. Father borrowed a small amount last year for equipment repairs, but nothing close to what they're claiming, and the interest rate they're charging is criminal." "Where is your father now? Resting?" The confrontation exhausted him. Her voice lowered. "He had another bad coughing spell afterward. Thomas, I'm worried he won't." She trailed off, unable to complete the thought, but Thomas understood. Ephraim Lawson was running out of time and Blackwell knew it. "I've secured lumber for the tunnel repairs," Thomas told her, changing the subject to more immediate matters, "and hired two experienced miners to help. We start tomorrow." Relief briefly replaced the worry in her eyes. "How did you manage that so quickly?" "People in this town aren't as loyal to Blackwell as he might believe. Many have their own grievances against him." Bridget invited him inside for supper, and as they ate the simple but hearty stew she'd prepared, Thomas found himself sharing more about his own past than he'd intended. His childhood in Missouri, losing his parents young, working his way west with cattle drives, and his dream of building something permanent after years of drifting. "Why a ranch?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Most men with your background might choose town life after so much time in the open country." Thomas considered the question. "I suppose I prefer the straightforwardness of it. Cattle don't lie or cheat. The work is hard but honest." He smiled slightly. "And I've never been comfortable in crowded places. Yet here you are in Belmont, involving yourself in our troubles." "Here I am," he agreed, meeting her gaze across the table. Later, as he walked back to his hotel room, Thomas reflected on the unexpected turn his journey had taken. His instincts told him that confrontation with Blackwell was inevitable now. The question was whether they could establish the Lawson claim's value quickly enough to make a difference. The next morning brought action. Thomas, Cooper, and Jackson began work on reinforcing the mine tunnel, replacing damaged support beams and clearing debris to access the promising vein Ephraim had identified. Bridget worked alongside them, her knowledge of the tunnel proving invaluable as they progressed. By the third day, they had reached new rock, and the quality of ore improved noticeably with each foot they advanced. Cooper, a veteran of numerous silver strikes, grew increasingly animated as they worked. "This is rich material," he confirmed, holding a freshly extracted sample to the lantern light. "Richest I've seen in Belmont in years." They established a routine, working from dawn until late afternoon, then bringing samples to the assay office for confirmation of their value. As predicted, Blackwell soon caught wind of the renewed activity at the Lawson claim. His first move was subtle. The lumber yard suddenly lost Thomas's order for additional timber, forcing them to source materials from farther away at higher cost. When that failed to halt their progress, more direct tactics followed. Two men Thomas recognized as Blackwell's employees began watching the mine from a distance. Supplies they'd ordered from the general store arrived damaged or incomplete. The assayer became noticeably reluctant to process their samples. Despite these obstacles, they continued making progress. By the end of the week, they had extracted several tons of high-grade ore, enough to demonstrate the claim's viability and potentially pay off the fabricated debt Blackwell was using as leverage. The confrontation they'd been expecting came on the morning they were preparing to transport their first shipment of ore to Carson City for processing, bypassing Blackwell's mill entirely. Thomas arrived at the mine to find Blackwell himself waiting, flanked by 4 men including the 2 who had laughed as Bridget fell in the dust that first night. "Mr. Wade," Blackwell called, his tone falsely cordial. "I understand you've taken quite an interest in this worthless hole in the ground." Thomas approached calmly, noting the positions of Blackwell's men and the way their hands hovered near their weapons. "It's proving less worthless by the day, Mr. Blackwell. Perhaps that's what concerns you." Blackwell's smile tightened. "What concerns me is trespassers exploiting resources that rightfully belong to me." "The Lawson claim is legally registered," Thomas countered, "and actively producing, as we've demonstrated this week." "A technicality that will be resolved soon enough," Blackwell replied dismissively. "Lawson owes me a considerable sum. When he fails to pay, which we both know is inevitable, this property will satisfy the debt." Thomas met the man's gaze steadily. "I think we both know that debt is a fabrication. Just as we both know why you're really interested in this particular piece of land." Blackwell's facade of civility slipped momentarily, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "Be careful, Cowboy. Men who interfere in my business tend to encounter unfortunate accidents." "Is that a threat, Mr. Blackwell? Consider it friendly advice." Blackwell adjusted his expensive jacket. "You're a drifter. No connections here, nothing keeping you in Belmont. There's still time for you to collect whatever Lawson's paying you and move on." Thomas noticed movement at the mine entrance. Bridget had emerged and was watching the confrontation with evident concern. "I appreciate the advice," Thomas said, "but I think I'll stay. The air in Belmont seems to agree with me." Blackwell's eyes narrowed as he followed Thomas's gaze to Bridget. "Ah, I see. The daughter has caught your interest." He laughed coldly. "A word of caution, then. The Lawsons have a history of poor judgment when it comes to investments and associations. Don't let yourself become another of their mistakes." With that parting remark, Blackwell and his men mounted their horses and departed, leaving Thomas with the distinct impression that the real confrontation was yet to come. Bridget approached once they'd gone, her expression troubled. "What did he want?" "To intimidate us," Thomas replied. "He's realized we're actually making progress." "Did he threaten you?" "Not directly. He's too careful for that." They watched the dust settle on the path where Blackwell's party had disappeared. "We should get the ore shipment moving," Thomas said finally. "I don't trust him not to interfere if we delay." They spent the remainder of the day loading the ore wagon and making preparations for the journey to Carson City. Cooper volunteered to drive the wagon, with Jackson riding alongside as protection. If all went well, they would return in 4 days with payment for the ore enough to challenge Blackwell's debt claim and buy them time to extract more silver from the increasingly promising vein. That evening, Thomas accompanied Bridget back to town to update Ephraim on their progress. They found the older man sitting on the porch, his breathing labored but his spirits lifted by their news. "I knew that vein would prove out," he said, satisfaction evident in his voice despite its weakness. "Blackwell's known it all along, which is why he's been so determined to seize our claim." "We need to be prepared for his next move," Thomas cautioned. "He's not a man who accepts defeat easily." Ephraim nodded gravely. "Bridget, fetch the strongbox from under my bed." When she returned with a small metal container, Ephraim produced a key from his pocket and opened it. Inside were various documents, including the original deed to the mining claim and what appeared to be correspondence. "Here," he said, extracting several letters. "These are communications from Blackwell's mining engineer from last year. He was surveying for tunnel expansion and accidentally sent us diagrams meant for Blackwell." He handed the papers to Thomas. "They show that Blackwell's eastern tunnel was deliberately angled toward our claim, contrary to his filed plans." Thomas examined the diagrams with growing interest. "He was planning to undermine your property from the beginning." "Exactly, planning to extract ore from beneath our claim without our knowledge." Ephraim's voice strengthened with indignation. "It's theft, plain and simple. When I confronted him, that's when the supposed debt appeared." "This could be valuable evidence," Thomas said, "but only if we can get it before the mining commissioner or a judge who isn't in Blackwell's pocket." "The commissioner in Carson City is an honest man," Ephraim assured him. "He's resisted Blackwell's influence before. If we can get these documents to him along with proof of our claim's productivity." A plan began to take shape. Thomas would ride to Carson City ahead of the ore wagon, carrying the documents and Ephraim's formal complaint. With luck, he could secure the commissioner's intervention before Blackwell made his next move. As they finalized the details, Thomas noticed Bridget watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher, something beyond gratitude or concern, something that stirred an unexpected warmth within him. He caught her alone as he was preparing to leave, finding her at the water pump behind the cabin. "I'll return as quickly as possible," he promised. "Cooper and Jackson will continue working the claim while I'm gone." Bridget nodded, her hands busying themselves with filling a bucket. "Be careful. Blackwell likely has men watching the roads." "I've avoided worse than Blackwell's hired guns," Thomas assured her. She set the bucket down and faced him directly. "Why are you doing all this? Truly, you could have been well on your way to your ranch by now." The question deserved an honest answer, though Thomas wasn't entirely sure he understood his own motivations fully. At first, it was about standing against injustice, seeing someone like Blackwell abuse his power and wealth to take what isn't his. He paused, searching for the right words. "But now, it's more than that." "What do you mean?" Thomas took a step closer to her. "I've spent most of my life moving from place to place, never putting down roots. What your father has built here, what you're fighting to preserve, it matters. It deserves to be protected." Bridget studied his face intently, as if seeking confirmation of his sincerity. "And when this is resolved, what then?" "I still have land to buy near Carson City," he said. "A ranch to build." Something flickered in her eyes, disappointment, perhaps, but she quickly masked it with a practical nod. "Of course. Your plans were clear from the beginning." Before Thomas could respond, Ephraim's voice called from the cabin, asking for Bridget's assistance. The moment passed, leaving Thomas with the distinct feeling that something important had been left unsaid between them. He departed for Carson City before dawn the next morning, taking a less traveled route to avoid potential confrontations with Blackwell's men. The journey was uneventful, allowing Thomas time to reflect on the unexpected developments of the past week, and particularly on his growing feelings for Bridget Lawson. She was unlike any woman he'd encountered in his travels, courageous, intelligent, and fiercely loyal to her father and their shared dream. The thought of completing his business in Belmont and continuing on to Carson City, as originally planned, no longer held the appeal it once had. These reflections accompanied him all the way to Carson City, where he sought out the Territorial Mining Commissioner's office immediately upon arrival. Commissioner Hammond proved to be exactly as Ephraim had described, a no-nonsense official more concerned with proper administration of mining laws than with catering to wealthy operators. "These allegations are serious," Hammond said, after reviewing the documents Thomas presented. "Tunnel encroachment is expressly prohibited under territorial statutes, and falsifying debt to seize a claim would constitute fraud. We have ore samples being processed that will prove the claim's value," Thomas added, "and multiple witnesses who can testify to Blackwell's intimidation tactics." Hammond nodded thoughtfully. "I'll need to conduct an official investigation. That means sending a surveyor to examine both properties and verify the tunnel placements shown in these diagrams." "How quickly can that happen?" Thomas asked, conscious of Blackwell's accelerated timeline for collecting the alleged debt. "I can dispatch my deputy surveyor tomorrow," Hammond replied. "He should reach Belmont within 2 days. In the meantime, I'll issue a temporary stay preventing any transfer or seizure of the Lawson claim pending investigation." This was better than Thomas had hoped for. With the official stay in hand, he completed the sale of the Lawson ore the following day, securing a sum that exceeded even their optimistic estimates, and began the return journey to Belmont. He arrived to find the situation had deteriorated in his absence. Blackwell, apparently anticipating legal intervention, had accelerated his plans. The sheriff had posted an eviction notice on the Lawson cabin, claiming the debt was now considered in default. More alarmingly, Cooper reported that armed men had attempted to block access to the mine, retreating only when confronted by the rifles Cooper and Jackson had prudently brought along. Bridget met Thomas at the edge of town, her face drawn with worry. "Thank God you're back. Father's condition has worsened, and Blackwell's men have been watching the cabin. The doctor visited yesterday and was questioned when he left." Thomas handed her the commissioner's stay order. "This should help. It prevents any action against your claim until the investigation is complete." Relief flooded her features. "You succeeded. The commissioner is sending a surveyor to inspect the tunnels. Once he verifies Blackwell's encroachment, the fraud charges should follow." Thomas produced a pouch of coins, and the ore shipment brought an excellent price, enough to counter any legitimate debt claim Blackwell might produce. Bridget's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks necessary. Let's get this stay order to the sheriff and then check on your father." The sheriff, a thin man with a perpetually nervous expression, reluctantly acknowledged the commissioner's order but made it clear where his loyalties lay. "This just postpones the inevitable," he warned. "Mr. Blackwell isn't a man who accepts defeat." "Neither am I," Thomas replied evenly. "And unlike Blackwell, I have the law on my side." As they left the sheriff's office, Thomas noticed several of Blackwell's men watching from across the street. The message was clear: the legal maneuvers hadn't ended the conflict. At the Lawson cabin, they found Ephraim confined to bed, his breathing more labored than before. Despite his weakened condition, he insisted on hearing all the details of Thomas's journey and the commissioner's response. "Well done," he whispered when Thomas had finished. I knew Hammond would see the truth of it. Save your strength, Father, Bridget urged, adjusting his pillows. The doctor said you need complete rest. Ephraim waved off her concern. What I need is to see justice done, his gaze fixed on Thomas. The commissioner's surveyor, when will he arrive? Tomorrow or the day after, Thomas answered. I came back ahead of him to warn you of his approach. Ephraim nodded, seeming satisfied. Then we'll be ready. A coughing spell seized him, and Bridget quickly helped him sip water until it passed. You should rest now, she insisted, and this time Ephraim didn't argue. Outside the bedroom, Bridget's composed facade crumbled slightly. The doctor doesn't think he has much time, she confided in a whisper. His lungs are failing rapidly. Thomas placed a supportive hand on her shoulder. I'm sorry, Bridget, but he's held on this long. Perhaps seeing Blackwell face consequences will give him strength. She nodded, clearly trying to hold on to hope. What happens now? We continue working the claim, document everything, and prepare for the surveyor's arrival. Blackwell will likely try to interfere with the investigation, so we need to be vigilant. Thomas spent that night at the Lawson cabin, sleeping in a chair near the front door in case Blackwell attempted more direct intimidation. The night passed quietly, but morning brought news that Blackwell had called in additional men from his other operations in the district. Town's filling up with hard cases, Jackson reported when he arrived. At least a dozen new faces at the Silver Dollar last night, all wearing Blackwell's brand of trouble. Thomas frowned at this development. He's preparing for something. Let's increase our own numbers at the mine. I'll hire a few more men if necessary. They divided their forces, Thomas and Cooper remaining at the mine to greet the commissioner's surveyor when he arrived, while Jackson stayed at the Lawson cabin to protect Bridget and her father. The surveyor, a methodical German named Müller, arrived that afternoon. He listened attentively to Thomas's explanation of the situation, then immediately set to work examining the Lawson tunnel and taking precise measurements. These diagrams appear accurate at first glance, he confirmed after comparing them to his initial findings. But I will need access to Mr. Blackwell's eastern tunnel to verify the encroachment. That may prove difficult, Thomas warned. Blackwell isn't likely to cooperate with your investigation. Müller smiled thinly. The commissioner's authority supersedes Mr. Blackwell's preferences. I have official orders requiring access to all relevant mining operations. They were discussing how best to approach Blackwell's property when the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Thomas stepped outside to find Blackwell himself approaching, accompanied by 6 armed men. Surveyor Müller, Blackwell called out, ignoring Thomas completely. I understand you're conducting an inspection on behalf of Commissioner Hammond. Müller stepped forward, official papers in hand. That is correct, Mr. Blackwell. I am investigating allegations of tunnel encroachment and claim interference. Ridiculous allegations, Blackwell scoffed. But I'm a law-abiding businessman. You're welcome to inspect my operation tomorrow. Today, unfortunately, we're conducting blasting operations that make the tunnels unsafe for visitors. Thomas recognized the delay tactic immediately. Convenient timing. Blackwell finally acknowledged his presence with a cold smile. Mr. Wade. Still involving yourself in matters that don't concern you, I see. The law concerns everyone, Mr. Blackwell, especially those who believe themselves above it. Tension crackled between them, but Müller intervened before it could escalate further. Very well, Mr. Blackwell. I shall complete my examination of the Lawson property today and inspect your operation tomorrow morning. I expect all blasting to be concluded by then. Blackwell tipped his hat with mock courtesy. Of course, we'll expect you at 9 o'clock. With a final warning glance at Thomas, he and his men departed. "He's planning something," Thomas said once they were out of earshot. "That blasting excuse is too convenient." Mueller nodded grimly. "I have encountered such tactics before. But delaying my inspection will not change the physical evidence. If there is encroachment, I will find it." They spent the remainder of the day assisting Mueller with his detailed examination of the Lawson mine. By sunset, the surveyor had compiled substantial documentation supporting Ephraim's claims about the value of the vein and its direction through the mountain. "The geological evidence supports your theory," he told Thomas as they finished. "This vein almost certainly extends into the area where Blackwell's eastern tunnel would be located if these diagrams are accurate." This confirmation reinforced Thomas's suspicions about Blackwell's true motivations. He wants to extract the silver from both properties through his own operation. "A common tactic among the less scrupulous mine owners," Mueller agreed. "Tomorrow will tell us if he has already begun doing so." Thomas escorted Mueller to the hotel in town, arranging for Cooper and several newly hired men to guard the Lawson mine overnight. He then made his way to the Lawson cabin, where he found Bridget on the porch, her expression troubled. "How did it go with the surveyor?" she asked as he approached. "Well, so far. He's confirmed the value of the vein and its likely extension toward Blackwell's property. Tomorrow he inspects Blackwell's tunnel." Bridget's relief was palpable. "Then we're making progress." "How's your father?" Her face fell. "Weaker. The doctor visited again and—" She took a steadying breath. "He doesn't think father will last the week." Thomas moved closer, instinctively wanting to comfort her but uncertain how. "I'm sorry, Bridget, truly," she nodded, blinking back tears. "He's holding on to see this through, to know that what he built won't be stolen." In that moment, with the soft evening light illuminating her face and the weight of her struggle evident in every line of her body, Thomas realized with absolute clarity that his feelings for Bridget Lawson had grown far beyond mere concern or admiration. Something deeper had taken root, something he hadn't expected to find in Belmont or anywhere else on his journey. "Bridget," he began hesitantly, "when this is over—" A sharp crack split the air, followed immediately by the distinctive sound of a bullet impacting wood near their heads. Thomas reacted instantly, pulling Bridget down behind the porch railing as a second shot splintered the post where she had been standing moments before. "Get inside," he ordered, drawing his revolver and returning fire toward the darkness where the shots had originated. They scrambled through the doorway as more bullets struck the cabin. Inside, they found Jackson already positioned at a window, rifle ready. "Shooter in the trees beyond the garden," he reported tersely. "Saw the muzzle flash." Thomas moved to another window, scanning the darkness carefully. "This isn't a serious attempt to kill, just intimidation. If Blackwell wanted us dead, he'd have sent more than one shooter." "It's working," Bridget said, her voice tight as she checked on her father in the back room. "This kind of stress isn't good for father." Thomas made a quick decision. "Jackson, stay here and keep watch. I'm going to circle around and see if I can flush out our visitor." Before Bridget could protest, he slipped out the back door and into the darkness. Moving silently through the shadows, Thomas used skills honed during years on the frontier to approach the shooter's position undetected. He found the man preparing to fire another round at the cabin. With swift efficiency, Thomas disarmed him and dragged him into the open where Jackson and Bridget could see from the cabin windows. "One of Blackwell's men," Jackson called out. "Appears so," Thomas confirmed, recognizing the man as one of those who had accompanied Blackwell to the mine earlier. "Though I suspect he'll claim he was acting independently." The shooter maintained sullen silence as Thomas marched him toward town, delivering him to the sheriff with a formal complaint of attempted murder. As expected, the man claimed he had been drinking and firing recklessly with no specific target in mind. "I'll hold him overnight," the sheriff said reluctantly, "but without proof of intent to harm." "Just make sure he stays locked up," Thomas insisted, and perhaps mention to Blackwell that his employee's reckless behavior has been noted by the commissioner's representative. Returning to the Lawson cabin, Thomas found Bridget tending to her father, who had been disturbed by the commotion despite their efforts to keep him calm. "Is it Blackwell?" Ephraim asked weakly when Thomas entered the bedroom. "Yes, though he'll deny it," Thomas replied, taking a seat beside the bed. "But the shooter is in custody, and the surveyor has already gathered significant evidence in our favor." Ephraim nodded, satisfaction briefly overshadowing the pain in his features. "Good, that's good." His breathing became more labored as he struggled to continue. "Thomas, I need to ask something of you." "Anything, sir. Protect Bridget when I'm gone." He paused, gathering strength. "She'll be alone against Blackwell and his kind. The claim will be hers, but a woman alone in mining country." "Father, please," Bridget interjected, distressed. "Save your strength. We can discuss this later." Ephraim shook his head slightly. "No time for later," his gaze fixed on Thomas. "She needs someone she can trust, someone with courage and integrity." Thomas glanced at Bridget, whose face had flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and concern for her father. "Sir, I give you my word that Bridget will not face Blackwell alone. I'll see this through to the end." This seemed to satisfy Ephraim, who relaxed slightly against his pillows. "Good man," he whispered. "Knew it from the start." The night passed tensely but without further incidents. Morning brought news that increased their urgency. Blackwell had filed additional legal papers claiming the Lawson Tunnel had been abandoned prior to their recent work, which would invalidate their claim under mining regulations. "He's trying everything to delay or derail the investigation," Thomas observed as they prepared to meet Surveyor Mueller for the inspection of Blackwell's tunnel. "Will it work?" Bridget asked anxiously. "Not if the surveyor finds what we expect in that eastern tunnel. Physical evidence of encroachment will override any paperwork Blackwell files." They arrived at Blackwell's main mining operation to find an elaborate show of normal business underway. Workers moved efficiently between buildings, ore carts rolled along tracks, and the steady rhythm of machinery filled the air. Blackwell himself greeted them at the administrative office, his manner falsely cordial. "Surveyor Mueller, right on time. I've had my foreman prepare for your inspection." He nodded curtly to Thomas and Bridget, though I don't recall extending my invitation to include additional observers. Mueller adjusted his spectacles calmly. "As representatives of the claimant filing the complaint, Mr. Wade and Miss Lawson have the right to witness my inspection." Blackwell's smile tightened, but he offered no further objection. "Very well. Follow me." He led them to the entrance of the eastern tunnel, where several workers stood waiting with lanterns. The tunnel appeared well constructed, with solid timber supports and a small rail line for ore carts. "Our latest expansion," Blackwell explained as they entered. "We've been following a promising vein that trends northeast through the mountain." Thomas exchanged a significant glance with Bridget. The direction Blackwell described would indeed take the tunnel under the Lawson claim. They proceeded deeper into the mountain, Mueller taking careful measurements and making notes at regular intervals. The air grew cooler and damper as they advanced, the lantern light casting eerie shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Thomas kept a sharp eye on their surroundings, alert for any sign of danger or deception. After nearly half an hour of steady progress, they reached a point where the tunnel curved slightly. Blackwell gestured ahead. The vein continues in this direction for another 100 yards or so. Mueller consulted his maps and compass. According to my calculations, we are now approaching the boundary of the Lawson claim. Impossible, Blackwell said dismissively. We're well within my property lines. The surveyor moved forward methodically, taking additional measurements before making a definitive statement. No, Mr. Blackwell. My instruments indicate we crossed the boundary approximately 15 yards back. This portion of your tunnel has indeed encroached on the Lawson claim. Blackwell's expression darkened. Your instruments must be faulty. I assure you they are not. Mueller pointed to distinctive markings in the rock wall. Additionally, this geological formation matches exactly with samples I collected yesterday from the Lawson mine. You are extracting ore from their claim, sir. The evidence was irrefutable, and Thomas could see Blackwell calculating his options, none of them favorable. The mine owner finally forced a laugh. A simple surveying error when the tunnel was laid out. Easily rectified with appropriate compensation to the Lawsons. It appears more deliberate than that, Mueller replied, removing the engineer's diagrams from his case. These plans in your engineer's hand show the intended encroachment was planned from the beginning. Blackwell's false cordiality vanished entirely. Those documents were stolen from my office. They have no legal standing. That will be for Commissioner Hammond and perhaps a judge to determine, Mueller said calmly. For now, I have sufficient evidence to confirm the complaint and recommend immediate cessation of all mining activities in this section of the tunnel. For a moment, Thomas thought Blackwell might physically attack the surveyor. Instead, the mine owner turned on his heel. This inspection is concluded. My attorneys will address these baseless allegations through proper channels. As they followed him back toward the tunnel entrance, Thomas maintained vigilant awareness of the workers they passed, many of whom appeared more like hired guns than miners. The tension was palpable, but Blackwell apparently realized that harming a territorial official would only worsen his situation. Outside in the bright sunlight, Mueller formally announced his preliminary findings. Based on my inspection, I am issuing an immediate stop work order for the eastern tunnel of the Blackwell operation. Furthermore, I will recommend to Commissioner Hammond that penalties be assessed for the illegal extraction of ore from the Lawson claim. Blackwell's face contorted with barely contained fury. You've made a powerful enemy today, Mueller. All of you have. His gaze lingered menacingly on Bridget. Especially you, Miss Lawson. Your father won't be around to protect you much longer, will he? Thomas stepped forward, placing himself between Blackwell and Bridget. That's enough. No, Cowboy, it's not nearly enough, Blackwell snarled. This isn't over, not by a long shot. As they departed, Thomas knew the threat wasn't idle. Despite the surveyor's findings and the legal victory they represented, Blackwell remained dangerous, perhaps more so now that he was cornered. He'll retaliate, Thomas warned as they escorted Mueller back to town. Legally at first, but if that fails. The surveyor nodded grimly. I have seen men like him before. They do not surrender wealth or power willingly. He turned to Bridget. I advise caution, Miss Lawson, until the commissioner's final ruling is issued. How long will that take? She asked. I will depart for Carson City immediately with my findings. Commissioner Hammond should issue his decision within a week. Mueller hesitated before adding, though in my experience, men like Blackwell often act before legal processes can be completed. This confirmation of Thomas's concerns did nothing to ease the tension that had settled between his shoulder blades. They saw Mueller safely to the stagecoach depot, where he promised to expedite his report to Hammond. As they walked back toward the Lawson cabin, Bridget seemed lost in thought. What you said to my father last night, she finally said, breaking the silence, "about seeing this through to the end." Thomas glanced at her, noting the uncertainty in her expression. "I meant it. But your plans, your land near Carson City." He stopped walking, turning to face her directly. "Bridget, I need to tell you something." He took a deep breath, finding himself uncharacteristically nervous. "When I rode into Belmont, I had clear intentions, simple ones, but now, she prompted when he hesitated. "Now I'm not sure those plans still make sense." Thomas searched for the right words to express feelings he was still coming to understand himself. "The ranch, the land, they were about having something of my own, something permanent. But what good is having land if you're working it alone?" Hope flickered in Bridget's eyes, quickly tempered by caution. "What are you saying, Thomas?" Before he could answer, a young boy ran up to them, breathless with urgency. "Miss Lawson, come quick. Your pa's took a bad turn." They raced to the cabin to find the doctor already present, his grave expression confirming their fears. Ephraim had suffered a severe coughing episode that had weakened him critically. "He's asking for you both," the doctor said softly. In the bedroom, Ephraim lay pale and still, his breathing shallow. When he saw Bridget and Thomas enter, he managed a faint smile. "The surveyor," he whispered, "found exactly what we expected," Thomas confirmed, moving to the bedside. "Blackwell's tunnel crossed onto your claim deliberately. The commissioner will rule in our favor." Relief flooded Ephraim's features. "Good, that's good." His gaze shifted to his daughter. "Bridget, my dear girl, you'll have what's rightfully yours." Tears welled in Bridget's eyes as she took her father's hand. "We did it together, Father. You, me, and Thomas." "Yes." Ephraim's eyes moved between them, a knowing look crossing his face despite his weakness. "You'll take care of each other now, I can see it." Thomas met Bridget's gaze across the bed, finding in her tear-filled eyes a reflection of his own feelings, grief for what was being lost, but also something new and hopeful taking root between them. Ephraim squeezed his daughter's hand weakly. "Be happy, my Bridget. Build something good together." They stayed with him as the afternoon waned into evening, sharing quiet memories and reassurances. Just after sunset, Ephraim Lawson took his final breath, slipping away peacefully with his daughter's hand in his, and the knowledge that his life's work would endure. The days that followed passed in a blur of grief and necessary arrangements. The people of Belmont, many of whom had maintained a cautious distance due to Blackwell's influence, now came forward with condolences and offers of assistance. Ephraim had been respected in the community, even by those too intimidated to show it publicly. Thomas remained constantly at Bridget's side, handling practical matters and providing quiet support as she navigated her loss. Blackwell, perhaps recognizing the poor optics of continuing his aggression immediately following Ephraim's death, maintained a conspicuous silence. The funeral was well attended, with miners from throughout the district coming to pay their respects. Even the sheriff appeared, though he kept a careful distance from Blackwell's men, who watched the proceedings from across the cemetery. As the mourners dispersed following the service, Thomas noticed Cooper approaching with an urgent expression. "Riders coming in from Carson City," he reported quietly. "Word is they're carrying the commissioner's official ruling." Thomas nodded. "Let's get Bridget home first. She's been through enough today." Back at the cabin, Bridget seemed to draw strength from the finality of the funeral. "I'd like to be present when the commissioner's notice is delivered," she insisted. "Father would want me to see it through." Thomas couldn't argue with her determination. They walked together to the town hall, where a small crowd had already gathered in anticipation of the announcement. Commissioner Hammond's deputy had indeed arrived with sealed orders, which he prepared to read publicly as required by territorial law. Blackwell and his attorney arrived moments before the reading. their expressions conveying confidence despite the surveyor's damning report. This certainty made Thomas uneasy. Blackwell had resources and connections that extended beyond Belmont. Had he somehow influenced Hammond's decision, the deputy called for silence, then broke the seal on the official document. By order of Territorial Mining Commissioner James Hammond, he began formally, regarding the dispute between Ephraim Lawson, deceased, now represented by his daughter Bridget Lawson, and Harold Blackwell of Belmont Mining Enterprises. The crowd leaned forward collectively as the deputy continued through the legal preamble, finally reaching the substantive ruling. Having reviewed the evidence presented, including the sworn testimony of Surveyor Mueller and documentation of tunnel encroachment, Commissioner Hammond finds in favor of the Lawson claim. A murmur ran through the assembled townspeople as Bridget grasped Thomas's arm tightly, her eyes shining with vindication. Furthermore, the deputy continued, Belmont Mining Enterprises is hereby ordered to cease all operations in the eastern tunnel where encroachment has occurred, to provide a full accounting of all ore extracted from said location, and to pay damages in the amount of $5,000 to the Lawson estate for ore illegally removed. The ruling was comprehensive and unambiguous. Blackwell's face darkened with fury as the deputy concluded the reading and affixed the document to the town hall notice board for public record. "This isn't over," Blackwell hissed as he passed Thomas and Bridget. "A piece of paper from Carson City doesn't change who runs this town." Thomas met his gaze steadily. "The law runs this town, Mr. Blackwell, even for men like you." Blackwell's attorney urged him away before he could respond further, but the threat in his eyes required no words. As the crowd dispersed, discussing the unexpected outcome in excited tones, Thomas guided Bridget back toward her cabin. "We should celebrate," she said, a tentative smile breaking through her grief for the first time since her father's death. "Father would want that." Thomas agreed, though he remained vigilant as they walked. Blackwell was not a man to accept defeat, legal or otherwise. The commissioner's ruling had cornered him, and cornered men were at their most dangerous. That evening, they shared a quiet meal at the cabin, joined by Cooper and Jackson, who had become friends as well as employees during their time working the claim. The conversation eventually turned to future plans. "The mine is producing well now," Cooper observed. "With the settlement from Blackwell, you'll be in a strong position, Miss Lawson." Bridget nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, though I'm not sure I want to continue mining operations on the same scale. Perhaps a more modest approach, with trusted people managing the day-to-day work." Her gaze shifted to Thomas, who had been unusually quiet. "What do you think, Thomas? Is mining a worthwhile investment?" The question carried implications beyond mere business advice, and Thomas recognized it as an invitation to share his thoughts about their future, potentially. "I think," he said carefully, "that land holds different values for different people. Some see it only for what can be extracted and sold. Others see it as a place to build something lasting." Bridget's eyes held his steadily. "And which are you?" "I came west to build something of my own," Thomas answered. "That hasn't changed, but my understanding of what that means has." Before he could elaborate, the conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, many of them, moving at speed. Thomas was on his feet instantly, moving to the window. "Riders coming in fast," he reported, recognizing the silhouettes even in the dim moonlight. "Blackwell's men." Cooper and Jackson grabbed their rifles while Thomas helped Bridget extinguish the lamps, plunging the cabin into darkness that would make them less vulnerable to outside fire. "At least 8 of them," Thomas noted as the riders surrounded the cabin at a cautious distance. This isn't a social call. Blackwell's voice carried from beyond the circle of mounted men. Miss Lawson, I've come to make a final offer on your property before I depart Belmont. Bridget moved to Thomas's side at the window. He's leaving, or wants us to think so, Thomas replied quietly. He raised his voice to be heard outside. The commissioner's ruling was clear, Blackwell. The Lawson claim isn't for sale. I'm not addressing you, Cowboy, Blackwell called back. My business is with Miss Lawson. Bridget straightened her shoulders and moved toward the door despite Thomas's attempt to stop her. I'll hear him out, she said firmly. We're protected by the commissioner's ruling now. Bridget, wait. But she had already opened the door, stepping onto the porch with dignity despite the intimidating circle of mounted men. Thomas followed immediately, positioning himself slightly ahead of her, his hand near his holstered revolver. Blackwell rode forward into the moonlight. He looked composed, almost pleasant, which Thomas found more worrying than his earlier anger. Miss Lawson, Blackwell began cordially, first allow me to offer condolences on your father's passing. He was a determined man, and I respected his persistence, even as we found ourselves on opposite sides of a business dispute. Thank you, Bridget replied coolly. Though I recall your business dispute involved stealing our ore and attempting to seize our property through fraudulent means. Blackwell waved this away as if it were a minor misunderstanding. Water under the bridge now. The commissioner has ruled and I accept his decision. He reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope. I've brought the first installment of the damages payment, a gesture of good faith. Thomas watched him carefully, every instinct warning that Blackwell's sudden acceptance was a pretense. What's the catch? Blackwell smiled thinly. No catch, merely recognition of changing circumstances. You see, I've received an attractive offer for my holdings in Belmont. I'm consolidating my interests in Austin and Virginia City, where the political climate is more accommodating to business. He extended the envelope toward Bridget. Consider this the beginning of a clean slate between us. I'll pay the full damages as ordered, and in return, I ask only that you allow my men to retrieve equipment from the eastern tunnel before it's sealed off. The offer sounded reasonable on its surface, but Thomas remained skeptical. Bridget, however, stepped forward to accept the envelope. I have no objection to you retrieving your equipment, she said. The ruling requires the tunnel to be sealed, not that your property be forfeited. Blackwell nodded, seemingly satisfied. Excellent. My foreman will coordinate with you tomorrow. He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. Good evening, Miss Lawson. Mr. Wade. As Blackwell and his men rode away, Thomas watched them until they disappeared around the bend, his unease not diminishing with their departure. You don't trust him, Bridget observed, noting his expression in the moonlight. Not for a second, Thomas confirmed. That was too easy. Inside, they examined the envelope, finding it did indeed contain a bank draft for the first portion of the damages as Blackwell had claimed. This only deepened Thomas's suspicions. Why the sudden compliance? Cooper wondered aloud. Man like Blackwell doesn't just accept defeat and move on. No, he doesn't, Thomas agreed, which means he's planning something we're not seeing. They discussed possibilities late into the night, eventually deciding to maintain a vigilant watch over the mine and to supervise closely when Blackwell's men came to retrieve their equipment. Whatever scheme he might be planning, they were determined not to be caught unprepared. The following morning, Blackwell's foreman arrived at the mine with a small crew and wagons for the equipment. Thomas, Cooper, and Jackson observed every move they made, ensuring they took only what legitimately belonged to Blackwell's operation. The process continued without incident, which only increased Thomas's certainty that something else was afoot. By mid-afternoon, the equipment removal was complete, and Blackwell's men departed still showing none of the resentment or hostility Thomas had expected. "Maybe he really is giving up," Cooper suggested as they watched the wagons disappear down the trail. "Men like him cut their losses sometimes when better opportunities arise." Thomas shook his head. "It's not in his nature. There's something we're missing." His answer came that evening when a breathless messenger arrived at the Lawson cabin. "Fire at the assay office," the young man exclaimed. "And they're saying there's trouble at the Silver Dollar. 2 Blackwell's men are tearing the place apart." Thomas and Bridget exchanged alarmed glances. A diversion, Thomas realized immediately. "Cooper, Jackson, stay here with Bridget. Don't let anyone near the cabin." "Where are you going?" Bridget demanded. "The mine," Thomas answered, already moving toward the door. "That's what he's really after." Despite Bridget's protests, Thomas rode hard for the Lawson claim, taking a shortcut through the hills. As he approached, he could see lantern light bobbing at the mine entrance, too many lights for the normal night watchman they'd hired. Dismounting a safe distance away, Thomas approached on foot, using the skills he'd honed during years on the frontier to move silently through the underbrush. When he reached a vantage point overlooking the mine entrance, his suspicions were confirmed. Blackwell himself was directing several men who were carrying crates into the tunnel. Thomas crept closer, catching fragments of conversation that chilled his blood. "Enough dynamite to collapse both tunnels. Look like a natural cave-in. No one will know the difference." Blackwell's plan became horrifyingly clear. Unable to legally access the rich vein that ran between the properties, he intended to destroy both tunnels, making it appear as an accident. With the evidence of his encroachment buried under tons of rock, and his operations in Belmont supposedly ending anyway, no one would look too closely at the convenient tragedy. Thomas considered his options quickly. He was outnumbered, with Blackwell's men already deep in the tunnel placing explosives. Rushing in alone would likely result in his death without stopping them. Riding for help would take too long. The dynamite could be detonated at any moment. He needed a distraction that would draw them out of the tunnel before they could complete their work. Thomas retreated to where he'd left his horse, an idea forming as he moved. From his saddlebags, he retrieved a small flask of whiskey he kept for medicinal purposes, along with a spare bandana. Creating a makeshift firebomb was simple enough, a skill he'd learned during the war. Within minutes, he'd prepared his diversion and circled to the opposite side of the clearing from where he'd been observing. Thomas lit the whiskey-soaked cloth, took careful aim, and threw the flaming bottle at Blackwell's supply wagon. The glass shattered against the wooden bed, spreading flames that quickly caught and intensified. The effect was immediate. Shouts of alarm erupted from the mine entrance as men poured out to address the fire, which threatened to spread to their horses and remaining explosives. In the confusion, Thomas made his move, slipping into the tunnel unnoticed. The lanterns left behind by Blackwell's men illuminated the passage as he moved swiftly deeper into the mountain, following the fresh footprints in the damp soil. He found the explosives approximately 200 yards in several crates, positioned at a critical juncture where the tunnel's support beams converged. The charges had already been set, wires trailing back toward the entrance where they would presumably be detonated once Blackwell and his men were at a safe distance. Thomas worked quickly to disarm the primary charges, cutting wires and removing blasting caps. He had just finished when he heard footsteps approaching from the tunnel entrance, someone returning to check on their handiwork, or perhaps to trigger the explosion early given the complication of the fire outside. He concealed himself in a small side alcove just as Blackwell himself came into view, a lantern in one hand and a detonator box in the other. The mine owner examined the explosives with a frown, quickly noticing Thomas's sabotage. "Who's there?" he called out, setting down the lantern and drawing a revolver. "Show yourself." Thomas stepped into the light, his own weapon leveled at Blackwell. "It's over. Your men are occupied with the fire and I've disabled your explosives." Blackwell's face contorted with rage. "You. Always interfering where you don't belong. Stopping a man from destroying legal evidence and committing murder seems like everyone's business," Thomas replied evenly. "Murder," Blackwell scoffed. "This tunnel was to be sealed anyway under the commissioner's order. I'm simply expediting the process." After loading it with enough dynamite to collapse half the mountain, Thomas kept his aim steady. "The truth is simpler. You can't stand losing. Can't stand that a small operator like Lawson proved you were stealing from his claim." Blackwell's finger tightened on the trigger of his revolver. "You're a dead man, Wade. Even if you walk out of this tunnel, you won't live to see morning. I have men throughout the territory who will hunt you down." Big talk for a man who's about to be arrested for attempted sabotage and facing additional charges when the territorial authorities learn about this latest scheme. For a moment, Thomas thought Blackwell might actually risk a shot, despite the danger of firing a weapon near damaged explosives. Instead, the mine owner's expression shifted to one of calculated coldness. "You know why I've been successful, Cowboy? Because I understand that in business, as in life, sometimes you must sacrifice a position to win the larger game." He gestured around them with his free hand. "You've stopped this attempt. Congratulations. But Belmont is still my town. The sheriff answers to me. The judge answers to me. How far do you think your accusations will get?" "Far enough," Thomas replied. "The commissioner has already ruled against you. The territorial governor has taken notice of this case. Your influence isn't what it once was, Blackwell." This seemed to strike a nerve. Blackwell's confident facade cracked slightly. "You think this is about one silver mine, one legal ruling? I've built an empire across this territory. This setback is nothing." "Then walk away," Thomas suggested. "If this is truly so insignificant, take your remaining operations to Austin and Virginia City as you claimed you would. Leave Belmont and the Lawson claim in peace." Blackwell laughed bitterly. "And let a drifting cowboy and a miner's daughter beat me? That's not how men like me operate." "No," Thomas agreed. "Men like you prefer to work from the shadows, hiring others to do your dirty work, creating accidents that can't be traced back to you." He took a step closer, his aim never wavering. "But that ends tonight." The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for the sounds of approaching voices, Blackwell's men returning to the tunnel after containing the fire. Thomas knew his advantage was disappearing by the second. "Here's what's going to happen," he said quickly. "You're going to order your men to clear out, all of them. Then you're going to ride out of Belmont tonight and never return. If you do, copies of your engineer's plans and documentation of this sabotage attempt will reach the governor's office and every newspaper in the territory." Blackwell's eyes narrowed. "You're bluffing. You have no proof of tonight's events." "I have enough," Thomas assured him. "And more importantly, you've made enemies throughout the district, miners you've cheated, businesses you've squeezed. Given the opportunity to testify against you with the protection of territorial authorities, how many do you think will come forward?" The approaching voices grew louder as Blackwell considered his options. Finally, his practicality overcame his rage. "Very well, Wade, you win this round." He slowly lowered his weapon. "I'll leave Belmont, but remember what I said, men like me play the long game. Our paths may cross again." "For your sake, I hope they don't," Thomas replied. Blackwell called out to his approaching men, ordering them to stand down and return to town. With reluctance, they complied, though many cast suspicious glances at Thomas as they retreated from the tunnel. Thomas maintained his vigilance until the last of them had departed, then methodically gathered the remaining explosives to ensure they couldn't be used in a second attempt. By the time he emerged from the mine, Blackwell and his men had mounted up and were preparing to ride out. "Remember our agreement," Thomas called to Blackwell. "Belmont is no longer your concern." The mine owner's only response was a cold stare before he turned his horse and led his men toward town. Thomas waited until they were out of sight before mounting his own horse and riding swiftly back to the Lawson cabin. He found Bridget, Cooper, and Jackson anxiously waiting on the porch, rifles at the ready. "What happened?" Bridget demanded as he dismounted. "We heard about fires in town and then saw riders heading toward the mine." Thomas quickly recounted Blackwell's sabotage attempt and their subsequent confrontation. "He's agreed to leave Belmont for good," he concluded. "Though I don't entirely trust his word." "Nor should you," Cooper agreed. "Man like that holds grudges. We'll maintain watches at the mine and here at the cabin for the next few days," Thomas decided. "If Blackwell's truly leaving the district, we should know soon enough." The night passed without further incident, and morning brought news from town that Blackwell and his closest associates had indeed departed Belmont, taking the road toward Austin. The fires at the assay office and saloon had been contained quickly, with minimal damage. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in Belmont transformed noticeably. People who had previously kept their distance now approached Bridget with congratulations and expressions of support. The full story of Blackwell's defeated schemes spread throughout the district, elevating Thomas's standing in the community and cementing the Lawson claim's legitimacy. A week after Blackwell's departure, Thomas and Bridget stood at the entrance to the mine, discussing plans for its continued operation. "Cooper and Jackson have offered to manage the day-to-day work," Bridget explained. "With a crew of local miners who are eager for fair employment after Blackwell's departure." Thomas nodded approvingly. "They're good men. They'll treat the workers right and keep the operation honest." Bridget studied his face carefully. "You still haven't said what you plan to do, now that the danger has passed." The question that had lingered between them since Ephraim's final days could no longer be avoided. Thomas took a deep breath, gathering his courage for perhaps the most important conversation of his life. "I came to Nevada to build something lasting," he began. "A place of my own after years of working for others and drifting from town to town." Bridget nodded, her expression carefully neutral though Thomas could see the tension in her shoulders. "The land I was looking at near Carson City is probably still available," he continued. "Good grazing land with a creek running through it, room enough for a decent herd and a proper house." "It sounds lovely," Bridget said softly, looking away toward the distant mountains. "When will you be leaving to claim it?" Thomas moved closer, gently turning her to face him. "That depends entirely on you, Bridget Lawson." Her eyes widened slightly. "On me? I don't understand." "I've spent my life alone," Thomas explained, finding the words easier now that he'd begun. "Convincing myself that independence was all I needed or wanted, that land and cattle and a place of my own would be enough." He took her hands in his, noting how perfectly they fit together. "But these past weeks have shown me something different, something better. A partnership that makes both people stronger, the kind your parents had from what you've told me." Hope bloomed in Bridget's eyes, though she seemed almost afraid to believe what she was hearing. "Thomas, what are you saying exactly?" "I'm saying I love you, Bridget. That I want to build that life I've been planning with you beside me if you'll have me." He smiled slightly. Or if you prefer to stay in Belmont and run this mine, I'd be proud to stand with you here instead." "Oh, Thomas," she whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. "Since that first night when you stood up for me in the street when they laughed as I fell in the dust, and you were the only one who cared enough to help, I've felt something growing between us, something I never expected to find." "Is that a yes?" he asked, his heart hammering in his chest. Her answer was to rise onto her toes and press her lips to his, a kiss that conveyed everything words could not: trust, hope, and a love that had blossomed amid adversity. When they finally parted, Bridget smiled up at him. "It's a yes, Thomas Wade, but not to staying in Belmont." He looked at her questioningly. "I think your land near Carson City sounds perfect," she explained. "The mine can support us while we build our ranch, with Cooper and Jackson managing operations here." Her expression grew wistful. "Father always wanted me to find happiness beyond these tunnels." He believed in the dream of something green and growing, not just metal in the earth. Thomas pulled her close, overwhelmed by the future suddenly unfolding before them. "We'll build something remarkable together, Bridget. I promise you that." They were married 2 weeks later in Belmont's small church, with Cooper and Jackson standing as witnesses, and most of the town attending the celebration that followed. The shadow of Blackwell's influence had lifted, allowing the community to embrace the couple who had stood against his corruption. Their journey to Carson City. The following month was filled with plans and dreams shared between two people who had found in each other something neither had expected when fate brought them together on a dusty street in Belmont. The land Thomas had set his sights on was indeed still available, and with Bridget at his side, he finalized the purchase with a sense of fulfillment that went far beyond mere property ownership. They named their ranch Silver Creek, a nod to both the mining heritage that had brought them together and the clear waters that flowed through their new land. The house they built was modest at first, but solid and warm, with rooms enough for the family they hoped to create together. As the seasons passed, their operation grew steadily. The mine in Belmont continued to produce under Cooper and Jackson's management, providing capital for expanding their herd and improving their property. Thomas's knowledge of cattle proved as valuable as Bridget's sharp business sense, making them formidable partners in both life and enterprise. Their first child, a son they named Ephraim Thomas Wade, arrived a year after their wedding, bringing new joy to their growing homestead. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 2 years later, completing their family and filling the house with laughter and life. Blackwell remained true to his word, never returning to Belmont, though they occasionally heard rumors of his operations in other mining districts. His defeat at the hands of a determined woman and a principled cowboy became something of a legend in Nevada mining communities, a reminder that even the most powerful were not beyond the reach of justice. On the 5th anniversary of their first meeting, Thomas and Bridget stood on the porch of their completed home, watching the sunset paint the mountains with gold and crimson. Their children played in the yard while cattle grazed peacefully in the meadow beyond. "You ever regret it?" Thomas asked, his arm around his wife's shoulders. "Leaving Belmont? The mine?" Bridget leaned into him, her head resting comfortably against his chest. "Never. The mine was Father's dream. This," she gestured to their flourishing ranch and the family they'd created, "this is ours." Thomas pressed a kiss to her temple, marveling still at how a chance encounter in a mining town had led to the happiness they now shared. "From the moment I saw them laugh as you fell in the dust," he said softly, "I think some part of me knew." "Knew what?" she asked, looking up at him with the same green eyes that had captivated him from the beginning. "That I'd found what I'd been searching for all along," he answered simply. "Not land or silver or cattle, but home." As the light faded from the sky and stars began to appear, they remained on the porch, secure in the knowledge that what they had built together, a love born in adversity and strengthened through shared purpose, was more precious than any silver vein or deed of land. It was a legacy that would endure long after the minds of Belmont had played out, sustaining generations to come through the power of two hearts that had recognized in each other the perfect partner for life's journey.